So you may have heard the story about the three preachers who were spending the day off in a fishing boat on the lake. And the first had to use the bathroom, and so he got up and walked across the water, did his business, and walked back. And then the second had to go, and so she walked across the water and did her business and walked back to the boat. And a little while later, the third preacher had to use the restroom as well, so he got up, but when he stepped into the water, he fell and sank and felt like he was drowning. So he struggled his way back into the boat and said a prayer, "God, let me walk across the water." And he tried again, and again he fell into the water. And he gets back into the boat and tries a third time, falling into the water once more. And at that point, the first preacher leaned over and whispered to the second, "Do you think we should tell him where the stepping stones are?" Sometimes we hear a story of something amazing and seemingly impossible, whether it be from the Bible, like Jesus walking on water, or something that happens in our own times, and we immediately want to explain it away, saying, "Oh, I bet I know what happened. Jesus didn't really walk on water. There must have been stones or maybe a sandbar or something." And then again, sometimes we hear a miracle story and we get caught up in insisting on its veracity, as if God's very existence depended on us believing something that contradicts scientific evidence. But both of these approaches can be distractions. Sometimes if we jump to possible scientific explanations or spend all of our time defending the historicity of a story that science tells us clearly isn't possible, we deprive ourselves of something more profound. We deprive ourselves of the opportunity to live with mystery. I think miracle stories, much like parables, and also similar, I think these are both similar to Buddhist koans, in that there are riddles or puzzles that try to help us unravel a greater truth about the world and about ourselves. If we change the story to make it seem more possible, or if we insist upon its historicity, that it actually happened in history, then we run the risk of missing out on its meaning, on its truth. Sometimes we need to embrace the mystery. Sometimes parables and miracle stories and koans aren't meant to be logical and literal, but are meant to be understood by the Spirit, by intuition, understood in the heart rather than in the head. And we see this same principle in the writing of the Apostle Paul when he contrasts the law of Moses, a set of rules that people who want to be good and justice-filled should live by, with faith. For Paul, what he calls faith is what makes one good and justice-filled, what saves or heals us, what makes us whole. And further, this faith is not about rule following. This faith is a loyalty, a commitment to something that seems impossible, the resurrection of Jesus the Christ. And we don't need to look past ourselves for the truth. This faith comes from our hearts. We don't need to look to heaven, to some faraway God, or to somehow rescue Christ from hell, because Christ is already with us in our hearts. Faith is a commitment of the heart. If we spend our time in our heads explaining away the resurrection, then we miss its meaning. We don't need to defend its historicity because that argument doesn't ultimately change its meaning. Like miracle stories, Paul, I think, asks us to embrace mystery, to look for the deeper truth, and thereby change our lives. How do we do that? How do we embrace mystery? Nan Yen, a Judaist? Nanyan was a Japanese Buddhist master. He once received a university professor who came to inquire about Zen and what that meant and how to achieve it. And Nanyan served him tea, and he poured his visitor's cup full and then kept on pouring. And the professor watched the overflow until he couldn't restrain himself any longer, and he said, "Oh, it's overfull, no more will go in." And Nanyan said, "Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" And this short tale from Buddhism demonstrates, I think, how we can approach miracle stories like Jesus walking on water. How do we find meaning in such a story if we come to it with our preconceptions and our assumptions? Perhaps, like the professor, we need to learn to empty ourselves. Thoughts like, "Oh, that can't have happened, it's physically impossible," or "To be a good Christian, I have to believe this, even though it doesn't make any sense." Those kinds of thoughts get in the way of seeking the truth that the story holds for us. And in fact, this idea of emptying is even found in the story of Jesus walking on the water. Like the story of the cup, the story of Jesus and Peter talks of a need to empty ourselves. It asks, why are we so filled with fear, like Peter, that we can't trust in our own power to do amazing things? Now, I actually admire Peter in this story. He saw Jesus doing something amazing and scary and said, "Call out to me. Tell me to come to you." And Jesus did. And then Peter actually had the courage to follow up, to step out of the boat. And he too began to do this amazing thing until he noticed the wind and the waves. And he was filled with fear and he began to sink. Why could Jesus do it and keep it up, but not Peter? Jesus knew, I believe, that in his heart, not just in his head, but in his heart, that his power came from God. And he trusted in that power. Peter was able to momentarily empty himself of fear, but then he saw the waves and the storm, and he was overcome. All of his fear and his doubt, it all came rushing back. Peter failed, but at least he had the courage to try, and I admire that. As much as I'd like to be the confident and together Jesus in this story, I wouldn't mind being courageous but fearful Peter first. I'm too often like the other disciples, huddling back in the boat, watching what's going on, fearful and not understanding. Not necessarily doing anything wrong, but not taking any risks either. Of course, this is not really about walking on water. It's about the many challenges we face in life. Do life's storms overwhelm us? We have lots of storms around us today, don't we? We're living in a pandemic. Our nation is struggling with so much political and social chaos. Life is uncertain, filled with anxiety and grief over changes that are out of our control. It would be no surprise if we were so filled with fear that we weren't able to trust in our power through God to do amazing things. But I think we can also ask, how might we instead be like Peter and at least have the courage to take the plunge and act, to do something? We can try to empty ourselves of fear, but that's no small task. And I'm not sure it's possible if we try to do it on our own. We have to walk with Jesus. God has to be there with us. And I'm not sure it's possible either if we just stay in our heads. We have to have faith in the heart, as Paul says. This whole idea of emptying ourselves is, of course, a resurrection thing. We're asked to die to our fear and be reborn in the Spirit. Emptying ourselves of fear requires that we embrace not the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, but that we embrace its mystery, that we embrace in our hearts the truth of its transforming power to act in our lives. When we live by a set of rules, acting out of duty, fear can overwhelm us. But when we live out of our hearts, out of desire, out of faith, when we live out of the commitment that the impossible is possible in God, that new life can spring from death, then a new world, a justice-filled world, becomes obtainable. And we know that the storms can be quieted when we realize that Jesus is now in the boat with us, that we walk with God. So how do we find the courage to step boldly into the water? To act, to do, to answer our call to build the kingdom? Right now, I think many of us have a lot of fear and anxiety to empty. We see those storms and we stay in our boat like most of those disciples did. Even while we yearn for the pre-pandemic routines of life, of being on more familiar dry ground, we become used to being tossed about in the waves. We find new routines and we settle in for the long haul. It feels many ways that's like where we are now in this pandemic. We've kind of settled in for the long haul. But are we answering Jesus' call in doing that? Or are we just biding our time until things feel safer? I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I think it's worth asking. We see the storms around us and we see what the transforming power of Jesus can do, but we're unsure. So like Peter, we too might ask God to call out to us, to show us the way, to invite us into Jesus' transforming power in the midst of these storms. And Jesus will call out to us. Jesus does call out to us. Come, walk with me. Build the kingdom. Seek justice in the world. Love your neighbor. Come, take the plunge. Will we? What are we being called to do at this time in our lives? Not necessarily when we find the safety of more familiar dry land, but right now, in the midst of the chaos. We need to ask ourselves that question as individuals, but also as a church community. It's a question that really never goes away, whether we're in good times or bad times. What are we being called to do? And to hear that call, we could begin with what Jesus did. Before he took that walk on water, Jesus went alone to pray. We too need to take time in our lives to pray, to meditate, to connect with the divine, to be with Jesus, to take regular Sabbath time, to remind ourselves of the blessings and the love that still exist in this world. And then at some point, we need to trust in the transforming resurrection power of Jesus and plunge into the chaos. At some point, we have to get out of the boat and answer the call. Paul asks, how can they hear if no one preaches to them? How beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news. How can we create God's kingdom of justice if we don't act? How can the world experience the good news of Jesus' transforming power if we ourselves don't live it out? And if we plunge into the chaos and we get wet, if we're overcome with fear and start to sink like Peter, if we fail, then remember that Jesus is there with us, here with us. And we can call out like Peter did, "Save me." And know that Jesus will do that. That Jesus is there ready to catch us when we need saving, to get us back in the boat where we can begin again. When we are in the boat with each other and with Jesus, when we know that we have each other and God to help us along the way, the wind will calm, the fears will empty and die down, and in our hearts, the impossible will seem possible again. What might we accomplish if we empty ourselves of our fear and trust that through God we can do the impossible? If we live out of the faith of the heart rather than the doubts of the mind. So don't afraid to get wet, to take the plunge into the stormy chaos. The very creative force that gives life to all of creation is here to catch us when we fail, that we might have the courage to again step out in trust, to build a world that believes in love and not hate, that treats the other, the unknown, with respect and compassion and not fear, a world that is filled with peace and justice. Amen.